Imagine a brutal double homicide, a master bedroom entirely turned upside down in the dead of night, leaving investigators to painstakingly piece together this massive, fragmented puzzle of ballistics and DNA. Now imagine that before a trial even begins, that exact same crime scene has been professionally sanitized, completely rebuilt, and listed for sale on the open real estate market. Today, we're looking at the shocking reality of the Tepee Murders. This is a case where the pursuit of justice is quite literally racing against the erasure of physical history.
So here's what we're going to cover in today's Explainer. We'll start with the prime suspect's startling courtroom behavior, take a look inside the actual search warrant, dig into the double murder forensics, and finally, unpack the highly controversial erasure of the crime scene itself. All right, let's jump straight into Section 1, A Surgeon Seeks Bail. We're going to weigh the arguments of a flight risk against a not guilty plea as we introduce our prime suspect, Dr. Michael McKe, the victim's wealthy ex-husband. To really grasp the vibe of these proceedings, you have to look at the suspect's demeanor. Psychoanalyst Dr. Bethany Marshall observed him during his arraignment, and she noted that his behavior was chillingly detached. She actually pointed out his contempt, stating that he was literally yawning in the courtroom, acting just so above it all. I mean, that kind of mundane arrogance, it is a wildly jarring contrast to the extreme brutality of a double homicide where the killer was lying in wait. Now, you really have to look at the stark contrast between his legal right to request bail and the prosecution's glaring evidence that this guy is a massive flight risk. On one hand, you have the completely standard defense playbook, right? He pled not guilty, hired a high-profile legal team, and is actively reviewing the evidence against him. But then look at the prosecution side. They're pointing out his vast disposable income as a surgeon. And honestly, just look at his track record. Right after the crime, he didn't stay put. He went on the run, fleeing over 400 miles, and actually scraped the insignias right off his car to avoid detection. It's an incredibly compelling argument against letting him walk free. Let's move on to Section 2, Inside the Search Warrant, and see exactly what investigators found when they unpacked the newly unsealed return from the Tepee home. If you follow court cases closely, you know that reading a search warrant return tells you exactly where an investigation stands. In this case, the return reveals that investigators seized exactly 29 pieces of physical evidence from the bedroom where Monique and Spencer were killed. Now, I know what you're thinking. 29 items? That sounds like a surprisingly small number for such a chaotic scene, right? But it's honestly amazing how those specific items break down into an absolute mountain of data. Those 29 physical items actually correlate to 15 latent fingerprints, an incredible 395 crime scene photographs mapping out every single inch of the space, 14 additional specific images, and crucial biological swabs loaded with potential DNA and blood. So how exactly do those biological swabs make it from a chaotic room into an evidence locker? That brings us to Section 3, Forensics of a Double Murder, specifically focusing on swabs and ballistics. Let's talk about the tools of the trade for a second. Retrieving DNA is definitely not just grabbing a Q-tip and wiping it randomly around a room. It requires a highly specific scientific methodology that totally depends on whether the biological matter is wet or dry. Investigators are hunting for the molecule of life, that unique genetic identifier left behind by someone who does not belong in that house. Here is how that process actually plays out on the ground. A forensic expert, completely kitted out in protective gear so they don't contaminate the scene themselves, follows some very strict rules. If they find wet fluids, they take a sterile swab, roll it directly across the wet area, let it air dry for a few seconds, and then seal it. Easy enough, right? But what about dry surfaces, like say a suspect touched a doorknob or a windowsill? For dry swabs, they can't just rub a dry stick on it. The investigator applies distilled water to the sterile swab first, then carefully presses it onto the dry surface to lift up those invisible skin cells, lets it air dry, and seals it. It is incredibly fragile, meticulous work. But of course, DNA wasn't the only evidence left behind. The ballistics data paints a horrific, highly precise picture of the attack. Investigators figured out that a total of 16 gunshots were fired from a semi-automatic weapon. 16! Monique sustained 9 gunshot wounds, and Spencer sustained 7. The distribution of these injuries, Monique on the right side of the bed, Spencer on the left, really drove home the brutal reality that the shooter was actively orbiting the bed, constantly moving around the room to fire those shots. And think about this. Every single time a semi-automatic weapon fires, it ejects a spent brass casing. Because the shooter was moving, those 16 casings ejected completely unpredictably.
They don't just fall in a neat little pile on the floor. They bounce off walls, they hide behind drapes, land on the mattress, or in some truly gruesome instances, they end up suspended in pooling blood. Investigators have to painstakingly sift through the scene, photograph everything as is, and retrieve those casings to reconstruct the exact timeline and movements of the killer.
But what happens to the scene after the police bag those casings, seal those DNA swabs, and leave? Especially when the house is quickly put right onto the real estate market. Let's move to our final section, erasing the crime scene and the paradox of cleanup. So before a home like this can be sold, it obviously has to be made safe. Professional biohazard cleanup teams are brought in, and let me tell you, their process is fascinating, intense, and totally irreversible. First, they seal off the affected area to create a containment zone. Then they come in with heavy chemicals, like a hydrogen peroxide-based illuminator. This stuff reacts with any dried blood on dark surfaces, turning it bright white so they literally don't miss a single drop. Next comes the physical dismantling. Any porous material that absorbed fluids, the mattress, the carpets, the padding, even the actual wooden subfloor, is physically cut right out of the house. Finally, all of it gets placed into biohazard bins, hauled off, and incinerated to ash. And this is where we hit a massive legal paradox. The home is made completely pristine and safe, sure, but the cost of that clean slate is the total vaporization of the physical history of the crime. Once those heavy chemicals are sprayed, any stray DNA that might have been left behind, destroyed. Inadmissible. The chain of custody is completely ruined. The mattresses and carpets are literally ash. Think about the famous Alex Murdaugh case, where the jury actually toured the untouched Mazzell estate to understand the space. In the Tepee case, that crucial point of reference for a future jury is just gone forever. And honestly, there is one more chilling irony hidden in this case, specifically regarding our prime suspect. Dr. McKe is a surgeon. While investigators are out there scrambling to piece together the evidence, a surgeon has daily, unchecked access to medical biohazard bins at his own private practice. It provides a horrifyingly easy loophole. Think about it. If he had bloody clothes or shoes after firing 16 shots, he could simply drop them into his office's medical waste. From there, they'd be legally sterilized with high-pressure steam and incinerated, never to be seen again. Which leaves us with this final, truly haunting question. Now that the bloody mattresses are ash, the subfloors have been ripped out, the walls painted over, and the home is up for sale, what happens to the pursuit of justice if a jury needs to see the crime scene to fully understand the truth? It asks us to weigh a really tough balance, the undeniable need for a family to heal and move on, against the very real risk of permanently destroying the physical echoes of a tragedy.